Montana Territory, late autumn of 1879. The wind cut sharp through Dry Creek as Delia Fairburn stepped out of the mercantile, clutching a sack of flour like it was the only thing holding her upright. A man spat near her boots and muttered, "Shoulda left with your kind months ago." She did not flinch. She had stopped reacting weeks ago. The stares, the whispers, the silence that met her whenever she entered a room, it had all become part of her world now. Ever since her husband died in a barn fire and folks started whispering it had not been an accident. They blamed her, said she was cursed, said she brought ruin. Delia crossed the street, her boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt, eyes down. The townsfolk parted without touching her. Even the preacher's wife crossed herself once she passed. She walked past the livery, where her horse was stabled, and nearly collided with a man leading out a chestnut gelding. "You all right?" His voice was warm, not pitying, low and clear. She looked up. He was tall, lean but broad-shouldered. His eyes were a soft brown, but sharp like he missed nothing. A white hat was pulled low over sun-dark hair, and his coat was worn but clean. "I'm fine," she said, voice flat. He studied her for a beat, then held out his hand. "Hollis Langford. Just passing through." She hesitated, then shook it. "Delia Fairburn." He nodded once. "I saw what they did. That was cruel." She pulled her hand back. "They have their reasons." "They do not," Hollis said. "They just found someone to blame." Delia tightened her grip on the flour sack. "You should not talk to me. People will start avoiding you too." Hollis smiled slightly, not mockingly. "I do not plan to stick around long enough for that to matter." He mounted the gelding, but paused, looking down at her. "You planning to stay here?" She looked around the quiet, cold street. The windows that closed when she passed. The children who were told not to look at her. "I do not have anywhere else." He tilted his head. "Then let's start somewhere new." Delia blinked. "What?" "I am heading south. Toward Wyoming. Plenty of towns that don't know your name. Clean start. If you want out of this place, I will get you there." She stared at him, unsure if he was mocking her. "You do not even know me." "I know what it feels like to be pushed out," he said. "That's enough." She hesitated, but the wind whipped harder, and she remembered how the general store refused to sell her sugar last week. How the boarding house raised her rent again. How the preacher would not bless her husband's grave. "Fine," she said quietly. "I will come." They rode out that night. Delia sat stiff in the saddle, her few belongings bundled behind her, wrapped in her late husband's coat. Hollis rode ahead, patient, never rushing her. They made camp just past the river, beneath a stand of pine. He built the fire, then stepped back so she could warm her hands first. They did not speak much, but something in the silence was easy. Not heavy like the town. Not sharp like judgment. By the third night on the trail, she was no longer flinching at every sound. She even smiled once when Hollis cursed at his stubborn horse refusing to cross a shallow stream. They passed into Wyoming territory on the 6th day. The land opened up, wide and golden under a sky that stretched forever. The sun warmed her face as they crested a hill, and she realized she had not cried once since leaving Dry Creek. They stopped in a small town called Graysons Hollow. 1 street, 2 shops, and a boarding inn. "This is far enough for me," Delia said as they looked over the town from the ridge. Hollis glanced at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "It feels like it could be home." They rode in together. The innkeeper was a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Talbot, who offered Delia a room without flinching. Hollis helped her unpack her saddlebag, then turned to leave. "You are not staying?" she asked. He shrugged. "I figured my part was done." She looked at him, heart thudding. "You do not have to go." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right." Over the next weeks, Delia found a job helping at the inn, mending linens and preparing breakfast. Hollis took work breaking horses on a nearby ranch. He came back each evening, tired and dusty, and sat with her on the porch while the sun dipped low. He never asked about her past, never pressed. But when she burned her hand on the stove and flinched from his touch, he did not pull away. Just waited, gentle and patient. One night, she brought him a plate of stew and sat beside him on the step. "You were right," she said softly, "about starting somewhere new." He looked at her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "You made it work. I just pointed the way." She smiled then, slow and real. "Still, I would not have come without you." He set the plate aside and reached for her hand, and this time, she did not flinch. "You are not alone anymore, Delia," he said. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt safe. And she knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. By the time the snow began to cling to the fence rails outside the inn, Delia had learned the weight of a quiet routine. She rose before dawn, pinched the lamp wick higher, and moved through the kitchen before Mrs. Talbot stirred. Hollis had taken to bringing in wood before breakfast. He never said anything about it, just left the logs stacked neat beside the stove. One morning, while she was rolling biscuit dough, he stepped inside with his hat in his hand, cheeks red from the cold. "Rancher up the ridge offered me steady work through winter," he said. "Cabin comes with it. Needs repairs." She dusted her hands on her apron. "Will you be living out there?" He leaned against the doorway, not quite meeting her eyes. "Only if it suits you. Thought maybe you'd come too. If you wanted." Delia wiped her palms along the sides of her skirt. "It's not much to ask, sharing a roof. It's more than that." He looked up then. "It's building something." She studied him, the quiet way he always left space for her to choose. "I'll come," she said. They spent the next week hauling what they could from town: blankets from Mrs. Talbot, a battered kettle from the general store, a second-hand table with one leg shorter than the others. The cabin sat at the edge of a slope, sheltered by aspens that rattled like bones in the wind. The roof needed patching, and the hearth smoked when the wind shifted wrong, but the walls were solid. Delia cleared the dust from the shelves while Hollis repaired the doorframe. At night, they sat close by the fire, and she stitched curtains from old muslin, her fingers working while his voice filled the room with stories of the road west of the town in Kansas where he'd broken colts for a man who drank too much, of a flood that took half a wagon train near Laramie. She didn't speak of what came before, but one evening, as she folded a washcloth beside the hearth, she said, "My mother died in childbirth. My father made it 2 winters after. That's why I married young." He didn't interrupt. He wasn't cruel, she said, but he was tired. It's a kind of hunger, being needed and not being loved. When she looked up, he was watching her not with pity, but with something steadier, deeper. "That won't happen here," he said. The days grew shorter. Hollis rode out to the ranch each morning before the frost melted, returning with his coat stiff and his hands raw from fence wire. She kept warm bread waiting, and he never touched it until she sat beside him. One night, after a long silence, he asked, "What would you do if you could do anything?" She thought for a while. "Grow things. A garden. Maybe keep hens. I like the way a place changes when something depends on you." He nodded. "We'll fence off a plot come spring. I'll build you a coop." The first snow fell heavy. It buried the fence posts and softened the world to silence. They stayed close, the fire steady, their movements quiet and sure. He came in one evening with a hollowed branch filled with honeycomb. "Found a hive in a fallen tree," he said, placing it on the table. "Thought you might want it." She touched the golden wax, warm from his coat. "You remembered." "Course I did." She turned to him, her hands still sticky with honey, and said, "You make things feel possible." He stepped closer. "I want to build this life with you, Delia." She reached for his hand, laced her fingers in his. Then let's start with that. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, the warmth held. They stood like that for a long while, the firelight flickering across their joined hands, the quiet between them full of promise. By late January, the wind had settled into a steady moan across the ridge, and the snow packed hard against the north wall of the cabin. Hollis cut thick slabs of fur each morning before riding out, and Delia had taken to keeping a kettle of beans simmering low most of the day, the scent curling through the rafters like a second kind of warmth. The cabin had begun to change in small ways. Hollis carved pegs into the wall to hang their coats. Delia stitched a quilt from scraps of old shirts the ranch hands had given her in trade for mending. The fabric held other lives in its seam's sweat, salt, the faint scent of tobacco, and she worked them into patterns that pleased the eye, not because they matched, but because they spoke to each other. One evening, Hollis came in later than usual, the daylight already gone. His gait was uneven, and when he dropped into the chair near the hearth, Delia noticed the way he favored his left side. What happened? Horse twisted wrong coming off a slope. Tossed me into a patch of sage. She knelt beside him. Did you break anything? Just bruised, I think. He winced as she pressed gently along his ribs. You need to rest. He caught her wrist lightly. I will. But let me tell you something first. She sat back on her heels, waiting. Rancher offered me a foreman's position. Said I've got good sense and steady hands. Her brow lifted. That's no small thing. It means more hours, but better pay. I could buy us seed and tools. Maybe even a milk cow come spring. Delia's fingers curled against her skirts. You're thinking ahead. I'm thinking of us. That garden you talked about. A fence that keeps out coyotes. A roof that don't leak when it rains. She reached for his hand then, folding it into hers. You keep building things around me. He shook his head. No. With you. The silence that followed was different than it had been before, no longer cautious or waiting, but full of quiet certainty. Later that week, Delia walked to the edge of the ridge where the snow had melted back from the stones, exposing dry earth and the first brittle shoots of winter grass. She knelt and pressed her palm to the ground. It was cold, still sleeping, but it would wake. She could feel it. When she returned, Hollis was smoothing down a row of notched cedar planks behind the cabin. What's that? She asked. Root cellar. Ground soft enough to start digging. She stepped closer. You don't waste time. He straightened, brushing sawdust from his trousers. I want you to have what you need. She looked at the unfinished boards, at the tools laid out in careful order. I've never had a man build me anything. He handed her a hammer. Then you'd best get used to it. They worked side by side until the sun dipped low. That night, they sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the stars break through the dark like scattered salt. I used to believe I was meant to carry pain, she said softly, like it was stitched into my bones. He didn't look away from the sky. Maybe it was, but that doesn't mean it's all you get. I don't know how to be someone who's allowed to hope. You don't have to know. Just stay. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the wool scratchy against her cheek. I'm not going anywhere. The wind moved through the trees behind them, but the cabin held steady. Inside, the fire burned low, and the scent of pine smoke clung to their clothes. Hollis's arm curved around her back, not possessive, just present, strong and sure. And Delia, for the first time in years, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about what she deserved. The thaw came slow that spring, creeping in through pale mornings and the soft drip of snow melt off the eaves. Mud clung to the wagon ruts between the cabin and the ranch, and the creek behind the eastern pasture had begun to swell, carrying broken twigs and last year's leaves in its current. Delia stood barefoot in the patch of earth Hollis had fenced off for her garden, turning clumps of soil with a short-handled spade. Her palms were raw, but the ache was a good one. Each strike into the earth was steadier than the last. A small pile of seeds, beans, turnip, and a few onion sets sat wrapped in cheesecloth by the stoop. Hollis returned that afternoon with a coil of fencing wire slung over his shoulder and a shovel across his back. His boots were caked with red clay, his hat pulled low to keep the sun off his face. "You've made a good start," he said as he stepped around the rows she'd begun to dig. "I was thinking of adding squash near the back. The shade might help them." He set down the coil. "We'll build a trellis. I've got cedar cuttings drying behind the barn." He paused, then added, "Rancher's wife sent word, wants to hire you for sewing. Says her boy tore clean through 3 pairs of breeches." Delia brushed her hand down her apron. "I could use the coin. And I wouldn't mind a ride to town now and then." He bent to test the soil at the edge of the plot. "I'll take you in tomorrow. You can pick out thread and needles that suit your hand." She nodded, then stood quiet for a moment. "You ever think of going back? To wherever you came from?" "No," he said, straightening. "There's nothing behind me worth walking toward. Everything I want's here." The wind tugged at the hem of her skirt. "You never talk about who you left behind." "That's because there's no one to speak of." He met her eyes, steady. "I ran with a string of trail crews after my brother died. Didn't stay long anywhere. No one looked for me." Delia leaned on the spade. "That kind of quiet sounds heavy." "It was," he said, "but it taught me how to listen." They planted the beans that evening. She pressed each seed into the damp furrow with care, while Hollis worked beside her in silence. When the last row was covered, they sat in the grass, dirt under their nails, shoulders brushing. "You ever think about having a family?" she asked, not looking at him. His voice was soft. "I think about the kind of man I want to be, if I'm lucky enough to have one." Delia turned her face toward him. "What kind is that?" "The kind who stays. The kind who doesn't raise his voice or leave when it's hard." Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the way the words settled into her chest like something she'd been waiting to hear without knowing it. "I'd want to raise children in a place like this," she said, "with dirt under their fingernails and stars over their heads." A long pause stretched between them. Then Hollis reached into his coat, pulled out a folded square of paper, and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch of their cabin porch, smoke curling from the chimney, the start of a garden out front. And next to it, a second structure, smaller, with a swing drawn under its awning. "What's this?" she asked. "Thought we'd need more space, eventually. For sewing. Or for a cradle." She held the drawing in her lap, the paper trembling just slightly in the breeze. "You already started planning." "I already decided you were home," he said. Delia turned toward him and touched his face, her thumb brushing a faint scar along his cheekbone. "I want to build that with you." He leaned in, slow and sure, and kissed her. It was not rushed, not uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that said they'd both walked through fire and now stood on the other side, whole. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "We should start the squash tomorrow." He smiled, a real one that reached deep into his eyes. "I'll cut the cedar tonight." The light was fading, but the warmth between them held. Behind the cabin, the trees whispered in the breeze, and somewhere in the field, a meadowlark sang its last call of the day. The lilacs near the well bloomed late that year, their scent soft and fleeting on the warming breeze. Delia stood at the edge of the porch, one hand resting on her middle, the other shielding her eyes from the sun climbing over the ridge. The shape of the days had changed again, less about the planting, more about the waiting. Hollis was in the field beyond the barn, checking the posts he'd sunk back in March. She waited until he came into view, then called out. "You've got a letter on the table," she said. Came with a supply wagon. He walked up slow, brushing his sleeves as he reached the steps. "From who?" Didn't recognize the hand. He unfolded the page, eyes scanning the sloped ink. His brow lifted. It's from a fellow I worked with in Kansas. Says he's headed west with his wife. Wants to stop in a few days, see the place. Delia's fingers tightened slightly over her apron. You want them to come? He sat beside her, the letter folded now between his fingers. I'd like them to see what we've made here. She let out a breath she hadn't meant to hold. Then I'll make up the spare cot. We've got enough butter chilled. That night, Hollis brought in a tin lantern from the shed. Figured we could hang this out front when they arrive. Help them find the path in the dark. He placed it on the table, his eyes flicking to hers. You all right with company? She was quiet a moment, then nodded. I'm not the same woman who left Dry Creek in the back of your saddle.
No, he said.
You're stronger. And you were already strong. The guests came on a Thursday. Their wagon creaked up the lane just before dusk, the wheels slick with river mud. The man, Eli, was younger than Hollis, but carried the same road-worn steadiness. His wife, Miriam, had a child's laugh and a basket full of dried apples. Delia poured coffee, while the men spoke outside. When Miriam asked about the garden, Delia led her out back, showing her the new rows of lettuce. They knelt together in the dirt, sharing stories of recipes and late frosts, and for the first time in Delia's memory, she didn't feel the need to explain herself. That night, after Eli and Miriam had gone to bed in the loft, Delia and Hollis stayed out on the porch, wrapped in an old quilt and listening to the frogs by the creek. She asked if we had kin nearby. Delia said softly. What did you tell her? That we're building family, not waiting for it. He looked at her then, a long, thoughtful gaze. We're close now, aren't we? She nodded. Late July, the midwife says. His arm tightened around her. I've been carving the cradle in the shed. Thought I'd surprise you. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice low. You already did. The days passed quiet after their guests left. The garden grew thick with vines, and the hens began laying regular. Delia walked slower now, one hand often resting low on her belly, but her eyes were bright, and her laugh came easier. In early August, under a moon just shy of full, the baby arrived. A girl, with dark hair and Hollis's quiet eyes. Delia named her Ruth, after the only story in the Bible she remembered liking as a child, the one where a woman chose to stay, not because she had to, but because her heart was steady. Hollis held Ruth in the crook of his arm as Delia rested, her hair damp with sweat, her breath slow and even. She's small, he said. She's perfect, Delia whispered. He looked at her then, voice thick. You did it. She smiled, faint but sure. We did. That autumn, the cabin took on a different rhythm. Ruth's cries came soft in the night, and Hollis rose to tend the fire, while Delia rocked her slow, humming more than speaking. The garden gave its last harvest, and they strung onions and herbs from the rafters. A second quilt was started, this one stitched from scraps of Ruth's swaddling cloth, the color soft and uneven. One evening, as the leaves began to turn, Delia took Ruth out to the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Hollis joined her a few minutes later, the smell of cedar smoke still clinging to his shirt. Do you regret it? She asked, rocking gently. Not once. She turned to him. Even with all that came before? He touched her cheek, his hand rough but careful. Especially because of all that came before. They sat like that until the stars came out, the land quiet beneath them, the cabin warm behind. And there, beneath that steady sky, with their daughter sleeping against her chest and the man she had come to love watching the horizon beside her, Delia felt something she hadn't known she could. Peace. A life not built in spite of the world, but within it. A home grown slowly, tended with care, and held together not by the absence of hardship, but by the presence of love, plain and enduring.